Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being here. Huaping, thank you very much. We are still really thrilled to have you here for this first symposium on your wonderful book. I have today the chapter, I think the highly important chapter 2 as the topic of the comments. And in my comments on this chapter, I have actually two main parts. In the first part, I will give you some highlights, some passages of this chapter which I think are important to get the point, especially for those who didn't have the opportunity to read the book. And in the second part, I have a bunch of questions, actually 5, I don't know, and they might be challenges for Huaping's project. So while I'm totally in agreement with Huaping upon all points to see Kant's role in this context of nexus of power relations and this perspective, this new approach, there are still some open questions, at least according to my reading. And again, I'm not sure whether they are even challenges or not. I'm going to raise my questions and we will see what happens. So, So here's the beginning of the chapter 1 in the introduction, where Huaping upfront says, what is the problem in the literature? For all the ink that has poured over Kant's relation to racism, surprisingly little has been said about how best to understand the very concept of racism as it pertains to him. So there is a lack of clear conceptualization of racism. And regarding the increasing work, at least in the tradition of analytical philosophy of the nature and functions and mechanisms of racism, this is really surprising. So given that we are talking about race and racism in Kantian philosophy actually since 1990s. So, and she goes on and she says, with a few exceptions, most scholars involved in the debate show two tendencies. The first tendency is that they equate racism with what Pauline Kleingeld calls racial hierarchism. So in this passage, Huaping characterizes the relationship between racism and hierarchism as an equation. Later on, she problematizes being hierarchism as an integral part of racism. These are actually two theses, but I'll get back to this. The second tendency is the so-called individualistic or atomistic approach to racism, by which we mean that these accounts link racism to Kant as a person, as an individual. They seem to be concerned with Kant's psyche or Kant's character, what kind of human being he was. And many of these people, not all of them, many of these people actually are defending a virtue ethical version of racism. I will get back to this. The main figure in this area is Jorge Garcia, who wrote a number of papers in 1990s on the nature of racism. And the account is that racism must be actually in your heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't call you a racist. But I'll return to this. So Huaping's account deviates from or goes beyond both tendencies here. And I will sum up the thesis of the chapter later on, but first of all, this is the ex negativo part, that she doesn't want to be part of this hierarchism camp or the interpretation of Kant. We will see what might be the reasons. And she's not giving us an individualistic account. So she's not concerned with Kant as, as a concrete, particular individual there, like with his psyche or virtues and vices and characters. And she goes on again, insofar as the standard approach to those questions is individualistic or atomistic in the way I explain in section 2.1, dwelling on them can blind us to the dynamic and intricate ways in which racism might have taken shape in the nexus of power relations in which Kant was embedded. So, and then her main motivation is formulated in this passage where she says, the most important thing is our anti-racist aspiration. This is why actually, this is the ultimate motive behind all inquiries about Kant's relation to racism. So, and I think most people who are working on the nature and functions of racism, they have this ultimate motive. Otherwise, maybe they need therapy or education. I don't know. So, here's another formulation of the ultimate goal of the chapter. It is not to pass moralized judgments about Kant himself for holding and teaching racist views, but to clarify the status of those views as a considerable part of modern history and an ineffaceable aspect of Kant's legacy. So in sum, the thesis is that Kant was Kant occupied, that Kant occupied a privileged social location that made him particularly well positioned to play an instrumental and transformative role, along with myriad other historical and structural forces in the nascent formation of modern racist ideology, which is actually a term by Sally Haslanger. I will get back to this. And another point in her final thesis in this chapter is that Huaping thinks, actually also in the first chapter, that there is actually no contradiction between Kant's race theory and moral theory. And what matters here is Kant's formative role or formative complicity for the modern racist ideology. I get this as the quintessence of this chapter, as far as we are concerned with the interpretation of Kantian philosophy. In chapter 2.2, so she deals with the characterization of Kant's racism. She gives us an excellent preliminary overview. She begins the chapter with the statement that a greater conceptual clarity about racism is needed in this field of investigation, and that the main task of this chapter is looking for a conceptualization of racism that facilitates a clearer and more fruitful understanding of Kant's relation to racism. So it's a relational question she has here. At the end, Huaping adopts Sally Haslanger's critical revision of Tommy Shelby's account and the resulting notion of racism as ideological formation. I quote again, "This notion will allow us to transcend the standard individualistic queries about Kant's racism and consider the roles that he, in virtue of his position in a nexus of power relations and meaning makers, could play in assisting, intentionally or not, the nascent formation of modern racist ideology in the 18th century." In chapter 2.3, Huaping introduces a great conceptual division of several accounts of racism in the contemporary analytical philosophy, and I take her actually to use these accounts as kind of blueprints in order to show at the end that Sally Haslanger's account is the most appropriate one. So I'm not going through the details. One division which I find it's highly interesting because people, especially those people who are referring to passages in, towards this perpetual peace or some passages in the doctrine of right, where Kant seems to be anti-colonialist or against slavery, they seem to have a narrow scope, according to Huaping's narrow scope definition of racism. They seem to reduce racism to colonialism and slavery, and whenever they see passages where Kant speaks against colonialism, they would say, look, here is the place, here is Kant, and anti-racist. The point is, racism and colonialism, racism and slavery are not identical. So if you would say that they are identical, I think I get Huaping's idea that then you are defending actually a narrow scope definition of racism. And here is the passage where she says, whether one construes racism widely or narrowly can result in very different conclusions about Kant's raciology in a given period. This point is most clearly reflected in the controversy over Kleingel's argument that Kant changed his racist mind in the 1790s. Even if she was right that Kant finally renounced racism in the egregious forms of colonialism and chattel slavery, her Kant might still be racist according to a wide scope conception. And we'll see what is Huaping's interpretation of a wide scope conception. So this is not Huaping. For those who are not familiar with analytical, critical philosophy of racism, this is a very, very simple, rough classifications of the theories we have at the moment. So, of course, every division of racism, every classification of the racism is contingent on the question you are asking there. Are you asking about the main agents of racism? Are you asking about the sources of racism? Are you asking about the manifestations of racism, or about those things which are making racism wrong? So in the language of meta-ethics, are you asking about the wrong makers of racism? This is a very, very complicated debate. I simplify that, so I just focus on those accounts which are asking about the source and agents of racism. Joshua Glasgow, a great philosopher of race, years ago characterized this question or this problem as a location problem. This happens especially if you're focused on individuals as agents of racism. And then the question is, where is the source of racism in the individual? Is it their heart, head, or their actions? And these are the names of that: attitudinal, cognitivist, and behaviorist accounts. Huaping actually deals with the two first, but not directly with the third one. Those accounts which are concerned on individuals are sometimes called agent-based accounts, which is not the very, very fortunate characterization, but I use it. It's from Faucher, a Canadian philosopher. And they, again, have different forms of analysis. Some of them, they offer you monistic analysis. So they are first concerned with states of mind, whether cognitive or non-cognitive, and then they just tell you it's just your heart, like Garcia. Or some of them would say it is just your cognitive mental states, as we say in meta-ethics and philosophy of mind, your beliefs. And there is a second part to this first group, people who are concerned or focused on external elements, so actions, behaviors. The second division are those people who have a non-monistic analysis. And again, you have a subdivision here. Some of them, we are still talking about the agent-based accounts. Some of them, like Lawrence Blum, see no problem that you have a disjunctive synthesis of these elements. So you might be a racist in terms of inferiorization, and that could be enough. You might be a racist in terms of antipathy. And also you might be a racist, it's not an exclusive disjunction. You might be a racist having both of them. So I'm not sure whether you watched the movie 12 Years a Slave. So some of people in that movie, they are just, representing the inferiorization without antipathy or antipathy. Some of them have both, and some of them have antipathy and not inferiorization. So this is the idea of Lawrence Blum. And of course, there's another group there which from the beginning, from the outset, is open for a conjunctive combination, so hybridization. So being a racist is always a matter of combination of heart and head, both of them. I think Bernard Boxill thought like this for a long time. And then you have the second major group who are non-agent based, so which means they are not telling you that the agents or sources of racism are always individuals, but also structures, institutions, and systems. So there are very, very fine differences between systemic racism and structural and institutional racism. I won't go into the detail. The point is that this is a more open approach, and among them you see Sally Haslanger and the late Lawrence Blum. For example, Sally Haslanger has a mixed approach which takes both individualistic and institutional racism seriously without reducing them to each other. And she also defends the plurality of agents of racism. moreover, she also defends the plurality of manifestations of racism. I'll return to this. And Lars Blum too, what makes Blum very, very interesting is that he believes in the plurality of wrong makers of racial ill. So he prefers to use the umbrella concept racial ill and reserves the concept of racism for only those severe forms of racial ill, not every form. And he really thinks there is a categorical plurality within racial ills. So back to Huaping. Huaping depicts perfectly, I think, most of the monistic analysis in this chapter. She touches upon some of the ideas of non-monistic analysis, and then she goes to Tommy Shelby, I will deal with that, who defends an ideological account, a cognitivist ideological account of racism. And by way of criticizing Shelby, she moves to Sally Haslanger with the result that this would be the most appropriate account for racism in order to throw a new view on Kant's relation to racism. This is the story here. So you see here a new way of conceptualization of Kant's relation to racism is needed. Besides interrogating his own beliefs about race, we should look into what roles he had as a social actor, and so on. And again, in the context of nascent racist ideology of the modern time. Here's a very, very short depiction of Sally Haslanger, at least in her paper 2017. I read this out. Haslanger begins by critiquing the cognitivist dimension of Shelby's account, which situates racism qua ideology in shared illusory beliefs and shared defective patterns of thought. What we take up through socialization are not just a set of beliefs or other psychological states, as Haslanger contends, but a language, a set of concepts, and other framing devices that create meaning, a responsiveness to particular features of things, and not others, a set of social meanings. So social actors make and transmit meanings within this semiotic net in a way that depends on such other material factors as relations of power. So shortly, Huaping tries to see Kant's relation to racism in this semiotic net. This is the idea here. And she writes, Kant, by writing and lecturing repeatedly about race, made himself a crucial part of the semiotic net, to borrow Haslanger's term, underpinning the incipient formation of modern racist ideology. Here another passage, maybe the first part is more important for my comments. Kant nonetheless, the second part of the second quote here, Kant nonetheless provided ample framing devices that could be taken up by other meaning makers and social actors in his extended sphere of influence, who could in turn add to the racist ideological formation through their own discursive and non-discursive practices. So again, the point here is, and this is part of the thesis, then it is Kant's weighty position in the semiotic network which matters. This makes Kant's racism highly important, and this is the new perspective that Huaping has actually in the whole book, and especially in this chapter. I go to the final part of this chapter, conclusion. Again, she emphasizes the advantages of Sally Haslanger's notion of racism, and highlights Kant as a prominent philosopher and as a lifelong educator. These are two social, historical, power-related rules that matter. And she reformulates the main question in this as one of the main questions in the investigation into Kant's relation to racism, and it goes like this. In what ways was Kant so well positioned that we could at least accept his statements about race to have a noteworthy impact on the racist ideological formation at the time? And again, what matters most is that he injected them, those racist claims, into a social structure in which they were prone to generating racist outcomes one way or another. This is another formulation of her guiding new question. I will skip that. Maybe the last passage again in the context of an incipient and dynamic racist ideological formation, whether Kant himself meant to connect the dots and explicitly spell out the racist implications is not as important as whether the dots could easily get connected in the minds of his students and readers at the time. Okay. Let me sum up with some other important points, and then I move on to the second part of my comment. First of all, methodologically, Huaping has a holistic approach to Kant's philosophy. This is highly important. She's not looking at this or that part of Kant's philosophy. She's considering them in a holistic context, and at the beginning of your book, you are dedicating this to Henry Allison. Second, she is updating the questions that are guiding our investigation of Kant's relation to racism. Third, she has claims on reconceptualization of racism in Kant's theory. Fourth, she is not interested in individualistic or atomistic approach, but rather focuses on formation of racist ideology. The place, as I said, and power location of Kant as a prominent philosopher and lifelong educator. As a formative, complicit of the nascent racist ideology. It's a kind of complicity theory, I interpret it. And two other things with which I'll deal immediately. Huaping seems to defend a non-moralistic account of racism, where she refers to Tommy Shelby. I will deal with this in detail. And Huaping wants to have racism, at least in case of Kant, without the element of hierarchism. All right. There are other positive points, of course, very, full of details. She has a critique of John Harfouch. John Harfouch's interpretation of Kant's racism is interesting. I will return to this again in another passage. But his point is that Kant has a racism of non-being, and that allows for annihilation of inferior races. He's not using inferior because as Huaping thinks, he's not using hierarchism as an element of Kant's racism. But he thinks that he goes really farther. He thinks this is not a racism of inferiority and superiority, but it's a racism of annihilation. And Kant's account actually allows you to annihilate the other races, which are not cool or good. And Huaping really excellently in a footnote criticized the problems of this interpretation, but nonetheless, she uses this as an example for those accounts of racism which go farther without the element of hierarchism. And again, I will return to this. There's a piece of critique against Naomi Zach's interpretation of Kant's racism using the division of intrinsic, extrinsic racism put forward for the first time by Anthony Appiah. I think this is a very, very important passage. The other thing is that Naomi Zach thinks that Kant is a traditional racialist, which means a race essentialist in the sense of Aristotelian or real essences of John Locke, and this is highly doubtful. Huaping actually touches upon this, not in this chapter, elsewhere. And a very, very important footnote on page 81, where she criticizes the lumping together of Kant's views of blacks and Amerindians. This is something which often happens in the US literature. Kant has really two different accounts. And as I will show you, his hierarchism of races is highly important, is essential to understand his accounts of the inferiority of part of the Amerindians. So I'll return to this. Okay, I begin with my questions, and again, not sure whether they are even challenges. We will see. I have 5 points. I will talk about beliefs in the sense of, the term which we use in the meta-ethics or philosophy of mind as something which is opposed to desires. This is not fortunate, but these are terms with which we are operating since decades, and I think it will remain like that. So mental states that are apt for truth or falseness, or if you were like, I don't know, like John Rawls, a constructivist, they are apt to be just or unjust, different, but they are cognitive mental states. So you could, debunk them, you could accept them, and there are different meta-ethical positions here. Whether you are a moral realist, whether you are a general moral cognitivist, or as some other some Rawlsians, you are a moral constructivist. The second point concerns Huaping's reference to Shelby's account. As far as I know, Shelby himself doesn't call this non-moralistic. This is, I think, your term. He talks about an immoral analysis of racism. I'll tell you what that is. The third point deals with Huaping's interpretation of Sally Haslanger and the topic of the pluralism of racism, both with regard to the agents and sources and the manifestations of racism. And then I go to the relation of hierarchism and racism, and as a corollary problem to this, on Huaping's non-contradiction account or approach. And I will take a look at this in a bigger context in the light of the whole movement of enlightenment. Okay. I told you what I think about beliefs, so when I'm talking about the beliefs, I'm not talking about the beliefs of Immanuel Kant, his Überzeugungen, but beliefs in the sense of meta-ethics. So as something which is opposed to desires, so it's a cognitive mental state. And I'm wondering, even it's possible not to consider these mental states, especially if you are defending a variation of an ideology account of racism. But because ideologies, or the formation of ideologies, whatever they are, at the end of the day, they are systems of thoughts. I mean, this is one part you cannot take out of ideologies. Okay, and thoughts are, built by beliefs in this basic cognitive meaning. So I think one way to keep the cognitivist account without personalizing it or be agent-based is really actually directly the role of the beliefs in ideology. And I do not think that Sally Haslanger would deny that. Actually, she doesn't. So there is actually no need to exclude beliefs. This is what I'm trying to say. There is no need, for example, for Huaping's account to exclude cognitivist accounts. You could extend them, but there is no need to rule them out. And besides, those scholars who refer to racial beliefs of Kant must not necessarily proceed individualistically. So by referring to Kant's beliefs as, as not personalized beliefs, you are not defending an individualistic account of racism in Kant's philosophy. Besides, there are other problems, of course, of, we know, just think about the thesis of opacity of motivational state. We just don't know what were the motives and attitudes of Immanuel Kant. It doesn't matter, and it's not possible. And Huaping herself, in several passages, says that. So we cannot determine that. It doesn't matter. not even in this room, you could say, what are my motives or what are your motives? So this is sometimes called the opacity of motivational state. So we have no epistemic access to non-cognitive states of the others, but we do have epistemic access to cognitive mental states, because once they are expressed, they are out there. They just live independently and they influence the world. They guide the world and manipulate the world and so on. So now let me go to Shelby. Part of my comment concerns directly with Shelby, because I challenged Tommy Shelby. I don't even know whether his account is sound or not, but not in a way that Sally Haslanger is criticizing Shelby. So it's another, I think, another path of critique. So again, Huaping seems to adopt Shelby's non-moralistic analysis of racism. And my question is whether she needs this and whether Shelby's account itself is a sound account or not. So here is a very, very short depiction of Shelby's account. For your information, Shelby designs this ideology-based account actually as a reaction, actually as a critique to attitudinal approach to racism against Jorge Garcia. So, I mean, he developed this account actually in a reply. So, a couple of years later, another paper, but this is the first try by Tommy Shelby to understand ideology, racism as an ideology. So maybe no need to read this out. I don't know, just I'll do that. So this is in Huaping's book. Shelby favors a non-moralistic approach which begins with a morally neutral definition of racism, a morally neutral definition of racism, with the sole purpose of identifying its referent. While all forms of racism, properly so-called, are prima facie a cause for moral concern, not every one of them necessarily represents a moral failing, let alone a grave one. Furthermore, what makes racism a cause of moral concern lies in its social function as an ideology, and so on. Now imagine, I mean, that my boss or my caseworker, my case handler is a racist person in the usual use of the word. And I think it would be really odd in a normal conversation to talk about my boss in the language of Shelby. So saying something like this, it's not actually him or his mental state per se, but it is about a widely shared system of beliefs with a form of social consciousness. So I think it must be possible and also desirable in anti-racism debates to address these instances of racism directly, all right? It is important to see racism as an ideology or systemic, but it must be possible to address these accounts too. And I think the pluralist accounts of racism, to which I return, could do a good job here, actually. And do not forget that, after all, Shelby himself concedes that racist beliefs, ideological beliefs, form a prima facie coherent network of thoughts, whether one belief is a part of a wider view of things, a component of a component of a larger systematic outlook. So, at the end, besides the pluralism of racism, even if you, if you focus on ideology, I do not think that you could refrain from beliefs as cognitive mental states. So I think Shelby's point is, by saying that we need to begin with an immoral analysis of racism, is just a methodological point. And this is really also the title of the section in which he's talking about that. The title of the section in paper is methodological consideration. What does that mean? It means that when we begin with the analysis of racism, we do not need a very specific substantive account for what is making racism wrong. Not that he's beginning absolutely with a non-normative analysis, but with a non-substantive moral analysis, okay? And my point is here, because sometimes Shelby is not clear about that, I doubt that you could even begin with a non-normative analysis of racism. I do not think that this is possible. So again, back to Shelby, I take his non-moralistic, as Huaping calls, critical point, rather directed at the virtue ethical, non-cognitivist background of Garcia's hard account of racism. It's a very, very specific point, not a general point. And oops. Where are we? It's too much. Sorry. And here I take a closer look to Shelby's main paper on his account of ideology-based racism. There are several problems here too. So if Shelby meant that we should begin with a non-normative analysis of racism, the first sentence doesn't make any sense. So because how could you get from a non-normative set of propositions to a moral conclusion? I mean, just think about is-ought gap by Hume or open question argument by G.E. Moore. So this is one problem here. The other problem, which really surprises me, and I'm sure Tommy Shelby has answers to this, is this passage which I highlighted. I mean, Shelby is a Rawlsian, you know, and he writes, beliefs aren't the kinds of things that can be immoral. They can be true or false, warranted or unwarranted, rational or irrational, but certainly not virtuous or evil, just or unjust, at least not in themselves. And by this move, Shelby actually is excluding a vast variance of moral realism, moral constructivism, and generally many moral cognitivists, whereby he himself is a Rawlsian. And you know that Rawls was a strong moral constructivist in the 80s at least. So later on, he was a cognitivist too, but a political one. So this is why I'm emphasizing the 1980 years. So I think actually there is no need to refer to this account, and I do not know whether this account is sound, and I suspect that Huaping's concern is actually that if she were not non-moralistic, she has to accept the individual approach. But I don't see that why. Okay, this is one challenge. So let me move to Sally Haslanger. I do agree, of course, with Huaping's interpretation of Sally Haslanger, but I think there is another part of Sally Haslanger's account which is highly important also for Huaping's account. So again, two main figures who are defending the pluralism of racism are Sally Haslanger and Lawrence Blum, and they are not looking at the pluralism at the agential level, that we have different agents of racism, individuals and institutions and structures and systems, but also where the racism manifests itself in beliefs, in attitudes, in practices, again in institutions, not with the focus on agential perspective, in utterances, in symbols. And Haslanger actually seems to be focused on the latter, on the manifestations of racism. Yeah, this is interesting about her. And this is why in many papers she's emphasizing the role of practices. And especially in the paper from 2017. So, my question about Huaping's, interpretation of Haslanger is everything fine. I'm with you. This is a great new perspective, and it will change, I think, many things in Kant scholarship and debates over the relation of Kant and racism. But at the same time, and this is a passage of a very, very important paper of Sally on the, on the nature of structural racism, she writes, if we want the term racism to capture all the barriers to racial injustice, I submit that it is reasonable to count as racist not only the attitudes and actions of individuals, but the full range of practices, institutions, policies, and such like that I have argued account as racially oppressive. All right? So again, you see her characterization is not non-moralistic. The word oppression is in it. It's not non-normative. She's operating with oppression. The same goes for Shelby. Even though he seems to claim that he has a non-normative beginning analysis of racism, this is not the case. I think Sally Haslanger has it from the beginning, and also in her definition of race, she incorporates racism into it. And secondly, she is a pluralist about racism. So my question is here, why Huaping is not pluralist at that level? I mean, she's not denying in any passage that that individualistic approach or attitudinal approach has values. She's open about it. But I have expected more, that she says, my account is actually complementary to all these other things. Why not? So, and I think this is the way that the anti-racism would be most effective. So again, another example. If my student, for example, happens to read Kant's racial claims, or is informed about a set of racial and racist beliefs that his theory defends or generates, this is partly a matter of individual encounter. And as such, it still matters. So again, why shouldn't we be more pluralist about racism, especially if you're referring to ideologies, at least against those non-cognitivist stances of racism. So I move on to the topic hierarchism. Well, I'm running out of time. I hope that I could wrap it up in maximally 10 minutes. I hope it's okay for you. So this is the main passage, I think. It's actually in a footnote where Huaping is talking about the conceptual relation between hierarchism and racism. And the point is here, she doesn't want Kant's racism to necessarily include hierarchism as an integral part. She doesn't deny that there are passages that hierarchism is playing an important role, but it is not a necessary element here. So, I have tried, Huaping is saying there is no unique shared conception of hierarchism among those scholars who have a hierarchist interpretation of Kant. She says that, but nonetheless, I have tried to understand what is Huaping's own conception of hierarchism. She's denying that as a necessary element, but what is exactly that she understands under hierarchism? And I found 6 possibilities here in her book. The first happens by referring to Inder Marva, where he is referring to the first essay of Kant on race, and it is, he says, if Kant subscribed to an explicit racial hierarchy based on proximity to the original human form, so Kant thought really like that in 1775 and 1777, that the original hypothetical pre-racial original human beings, there were brunette whites. And he kind of defended the idea Europeans are superior because they are more close to that original shape. He dropped that thesis in 1785. But here it seems that Huaping, via Inder Marva, is defining hierarchism in terms of closeness to the original. The second is this passage where she refers to inferiority and superiority, this ladder of intellectual capacities and moral status, and she ascribes this to Kleingeld. The third happens by referring to Boxell, where he differentiates between hierarchy and ranking. And it seems that Boxell is connecting hierarchy only or hierarchism only to egregious forms of colonialism, slavery, and racial exploitation. The fourth is by referring to Harfuch. I have mentioned this, which has with his interpretation of racism as a form of racism of non-being, which allows for annihilation. Fifth, and this is highly important, a footnote by analogy to Kant's account of gender differences. She tries to show us that hierarchism doesn't need to be an integral part of racism. Here she connects being beauty with doing domestic work, and being sublime with being with its political agency or legal agency. I take this as a reference to pre-critical writings of Immanuel Kant, where he talks about this division. There are notes afterwards in critical period too. I do not deny that, but mainly in an essay, I think 1764, I don't know, or 67, he talks about these differences. All these emphasizes are mine. Sorry, I just forgot to tell you that. And Huaping herself is talking about their places in society. I will return to this again. And sixth is a reference to Goldberg, his, I would say, thin account of racism, where he says, at the end of the day, racism is about exclusion. Yeah. And there are, of course, some problems. How would you, differ between racializing and gender-based or patriarchy discrimination? I think Goldberg managed to do that, but whatever, this is a reference to Goldberg, and I think Huaping, when she says, I have a sufficient non-hierarchist account of racism in Kant, actually she's accepting, correct me if I'm wrong, she's accepting the exclusion thesis of Goldberg. So I took it like this. And again, I've highlighted some words in this passage. Goldberg himself is talking about social power, position in the society, and dominant group, and so on. So I have not so much time, so I cannot go through all these different forms of understanding of hierarchism, but here are some challenges. So related to point one, why should be hierarchism based on or even conceived of in light of proximity to the original? First, I skip 2 and 3. 4. Even if we set aside the problems of John Harfuch's interpretation, which I told you Huaping excellently mentions and enumerates in a footnote on page 81, it is not clear why and how could intentional annihilation be conceived of without hierarchism. Intentional annihilation. Point 5. I'm just wondering where we get this interdependency of, on the one hand, between being beautiful and doing the domestic work, and on the other hand, being sublime and being a political legal agent. And if we somehow manage to get that, how could be this possible without any conception of hierarchy? So relations of power. After all, I mean, Goldberg himself, Huaping herself is talking about the differences, these differences of genders in turn, she writes, determines their places in society. Number 6, why can one not take Goldberg's account as a version of weak hierarchism? After all, he talks about the power relations positions, and note that racial exclusion, according to Goldberg, is not a matter of taste or just random or arbitrary decision or mechanism. It is something that the dominant racial group does, and for that group has reasons, which means there are things that are making their racial differentiations racist. And how are we to conceive of those reasons without any form of hierarchy? So I think Huaping's concern here is that if she accepted hierarchism as an integral part of racism in Kant's account, she must accept the contradiction approach. This is my interpretation. So depending on what the appropriate characterization of hierarchism is, I think it is not only not possible to take hierarchism out of the conception of Kant's conception of racism. It is, if we were especially social constructionists about race, it is not desirable to do that. I mean, just one example. You know, I guess all of you know about the debate in the middle of the 16th century between De las Casas and Sepulveda. The Sepulveda, the bad guy, thought that natives, so Native Americans, all of them, they are subhumans. In terms of his Aristotelian conception of reason, he thought they have no reason. But still, this is interesting. Sepulveda thought they could be useful for Spaniards. They could be amenable to Christianity, and this should happen by force. It is a good thing to enslave them. And now I want you to look at Kant and what he thinks about Amerindians and part of Amerindians. This is, I'm sure you know these passages. The first one is from 1788. He republished that in 1797 and 1799 again, unchanged. And here he goes. Part of Amerindians are too weak for hand labor, too indifferent for industry, Emsichkeit, and incapable of any culture. This racial group ranks still far below even the N. I'm not using N here in the US-American context in a pejorative sense. I'm not spelling that out. Who stands on the lowest of all the other steps that we have named the differences of races. And then this is a passage of his lecture on geography, 1792, and of course it is repeated in all other versions. Actually, the same thesis: humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The N are much lower, and the lowest of all is part of the American races. You see, I mean, in some respects, Kant's account of part of the Amerindians is even worse than Sepulveda. This is important to emphasize, and you cannot get this point without the element of hierarchism. So I get back to Huaping's footnote where she says, it is highly important not to lump together Kant's account of blacks and Amerindians. And I think, I get you to be in sympathy with social constructionism, it is up to us to decide, you know, what we get out of racism or not. And I think it is not only not possible to get hierarchism out of racism, but it is not desirable. So the question is, what is the appropriate conception of hierarchism? And this is open, still open to me, what she does. I go to my final point. It takes just 2 minutes. Sorry. Actually, need a third hand. So, sorry, just a minute. Whatever, I cannot find it. The final point is about Huaping's interpretation of the contradiction between moral philosophy of Kant and his raciology. So it is clear to me, at least, that Huaping wants to have a non-contradiction approach. So, you know, at the end, you know, there is actually no contradiction. You know, and this is not concerning only Paulina Kleingeld, but also Charles Mills. Although Huaping and Charles Mills, as she says, end the same place. So, because at the end of the day, Charles Mills says, you know, I want to get Kant consistent. I accept initially there is a contradiction. In order to understand this contradiction or tension, sometimes he says, we have to understand his account of personhood in hierarchical form. Some people are full persons, some other are not. And if we understood Kant like this, then he is consistent. He was a consistent inegalitarian. Everything which is beautiful, everything which is fine, it's not meant for you. It's for the white people. And he goes farther as far for the white man. So it's a beautiful word, but not for me. So this is the idea. Huaping's right from the beginning, she says there is no logical contradiction. And she goes on these three different levels and shows us, and this idea of universalization and generalization, and she aims to show that there is actually no contradiction. So far, so good. I mean, this is something we have to discuss. But this is a passage of a very, very important book by Dorinda Outram, 2005, about enlightenment. The contradiction between support for supposedly universal rights and the actual exclusion of large numbers of human beings from the enjoyment of those rights is central to and characteristic of Enlightenment thought. Now my question is, we have two options, I think, here. If we accepted Huaping's interpretation of non-contradiction in Kant's account, what is exactly the relation of this Kant-specific account to this big narrative that actually Enlightenment has contradictions? How are they related? This is one thing. Or you go the hard way down. You say, it's not only Kant. The whole movement, the whole period of Enlightenment is non-contradictory. The whole thing was infected intrinsically, inherently. There is no contradiction. Just bite the bullet. I mean, right from the beginning, the very nature of the reason so conceived of most important people in the Enlightenment was racist, was discriminatory. And then I think, if you go that way, at the end of the day, you must be an anti-Enlightenment person. I mean, yeah. And I do not think that's a good idea.
You have to be an
anti-Enlightenment.
Anti-Enlightenment.
And I do not think that that's a good idea. And I do not think that Huaping herself would think that that's a good idea. Okay. So that's it. Thank you very much. And yeah.